My name is Paul Chamberlin. I'm an associate professor in the history department here at Columbia University. My specialty is 20th century international history, work on the Cold War, and I generally specialize on the Middle East, but for the current project I sort of tried to widen the scope a little bit to look at Asia more generally. The book kind of began out of this sense that I had that we didn't really have a clear picture of what the Cold War looked like in the developing world. There's a kind of general consensus on this idea that something on the order of 20 million people were killed in violent conflicts between 1945 and 1990, and that most of these conflicts at least were indirectly related to the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. But the general way that people talk about these things is that they happened in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. And there wasn't a very clear sense of the geography of this violence. People hadn't done a lot to answer this question of where and when these conflicts took place, how they actually appeared to people who lived through them. And so I felt like there was a need for this kind of study. And I basically just set about trying to write that book. And so initially this was a history of the Cold War in the Third World. But as I began to focus in and look more closely at the patterns of violence that I was finding, what I actually discovered is that the real subject that I was grappling with was essentially a strip of territory that ran from northeast China, or Manchuria, down into Southeast Asia, across South Asia and into the Middle East, finally ending at the shores of the Mediterranean. And that this strip of territory, which was actually comparatively narrow, really constituted the most violent, deadliest theater of military operations during the Cold War. And that was a pattern that I was interested in, and I wanted to figure out why that was the case, to try to explain it. So one of the things that I found was that there was, in addition to this sort of geographic pattern, there was also a chronological pattern to the way that violence occurred during this period. In fact, there were really three major waves of violence which broke out. The first occurred in East Asia between approximately 1946 and 1954. The second took place in Southeast Asia between about 1960 and finally wrapped up around 1979. And the third really focused on what we can think of as the Middle East and Central Asia, beginning about 1975 and ending around 1990. And much of what was happening in these conflicts was basically associated with various post-colonial revolutions. So the first major one in East Asia was, of course, the Chinese Revolution. And much of what I found in this sort of first wave of violence is that it was closely tied both to the collapse of the Japanese Empire, and so these were recently kind of decolonized territories. And then they were territories that were also affected by the waves emanating from the Chinese Revolution. And so that was really central to explaining that first wave of violence. The second wave of violence is, of course, tied to the Vietnamese Revolution and the Vietnam War, in addition to the various patterns of US, Chinese, and Soviet intervention in South and Southeast Asia during the sort of middle decades of the Cold War. And then, of course, the third wave of violence in the Middle East was shaped in powerful ways by the Iranian Revolution. And so you really have three waves of violence, all of which take place in these kind of post-colonial territories, all of which involve the intervention of outside powers, but all of which are really anchored in these major post-colonial revolutions of the Cold War era. sort of key characteristic in this first wave of revolutions is that it is, as I said, anchored in the Chinese Revolution. And so you have this very powerful ideological force of Maoism, which is driving a lot of violence, is inspiring a lot of these revolutionary forces. And you also have various conduits of material support emanating initially from the Soviet Union, but later on from China itself. And so in these earlier stages, it really is this sort of global communist movement, which is playing an important role in supporting local revolutionary action. That continues into the second wave, which focuses, as I said, in South and Southeast Asia. But at the same time, it's deeply marked by the various forces coming out of the Sino-Soviet split. So what you begin to see in these middle decades of the Cold War is that you have both Beijing and Moscow competing with one another to provide support for various revolutionary movements, particularly in this sort of southeast corner of Asia. And that plays a really important role in explaining the sort of violence that you see in places like Indonesia in 1965. It plays an important role in the Vietnamese Revolution, in Cambodia. It plays an important role in Bangladesh. And really in all of these cases, the Sino-Soviet split is an important factor that has gone, I think, largely unacknowledged in a lot of the mainstream historiography. Interestingly enough, that completely transforms by the time you get to this third stage, which is more focused on the Middle East, where suddenly you have the United States, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia emerging as these key forces giving material support to revolutionary movements. The most famous of these is, of course, the war in Afghanistan, the Afghan Mujahideen, and really you have this curious situation by the 1980s where probably the two largest sponsors of revolutionary movements in the post-colonial world are the United States and Saudi Arabia. So you have this movement from the early Cold War, where it's really sort of Marxist regimes which were backing revolution, to this reality by the end of the Cold War, where it's really the United States and its allies that are playing key roles in supporting revolutionary forces. I do argue in the book that it really is, the genesis of these movements is not so much the actions of outside powers, but rather these local players. Mm-hmm. And that outside powers attach themselves to local movements that already exist. So essentially what you have is you have this dynamic where the superpowers are looking for opportunities and local revolutionary forces are, opening the door to various types of outside influence. So it's less a story about the United States or the Soviet Union or the People's Republic of China driving events than it is a story about local revolutionary forces attaching themselves to these sort of larger international forces.